Turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much for having me here. And before I share my screen, my name is Sophia. My pronouns are she, her. And please feel free to just add questions throughout the presentation to the chat. If there's something that really needs to be addressed in the moment, please let Hannah know, and I'm more than happy to stop and address any comments, questions, concerns that may arise during the presentation, right? So I'm gonna share my screen. Perfect. I think you can see my screen. Great. Excellent. So the agenda for today is very straightforward. I will start with an introduction of myself, of my background, and then we'll discuss what design research is and what human-centered design or design thinking is. Maybe some of you have come across these terms. Some of you may have been using it in your everyday work. So yeah, I just want to hear some of your experiences as we go. And then I will give you some examples of projects that have kind of stemmed of the different parts of the design thinking process. And then we'll discuss a case study that I worked on in Mexico for the Mexico City government. And finally, just wrap up with why is this important? Why is it that we are kind of providing this workshop today for you? So to get us started, as Hannah mentioned, my background is actually as a public sector professional worker in Mexico. I started my career in the public sector working for the innovation lab for Mexico City called Laboratorio para la Ciudad. I then went on to do design research for the National Digital Strategy at Mexico Digital. And then I got really, really interested about these topics and wanted to research much more about them. So I went on to do a PhD at Carnegie Mellon, where the topic of my dissertation was public sector innovation through design. And now I work as an assistant professor at Northeastern University, and I'm affiliated to a couple of places. So the Burns Center for Social Change, the GovLab, and I'm a professor at the Department of Art and Design. So just to get us started, I want us to give a kind of broad definition of what design thinking is. So according to the Nielsen Norman Group, they have been doing design research and design implementation for a really long time. It has been led by a UX pioneer, Don Norman. They say the design thinking ideology asserts that a hands-on, user-centric approach to problem solving can lead to innovation, and innovation can lead to differentiation and a competitive advantage. This hands-on, user-centric approach is defined by the design thinking process and comprises 6 distinct phases. They talk about 6 distinct phases that I will go through in a minute. To simplify a little bit the process, we usually talk about it in 5 phases, given that we consider testing and implementation kind of the same loop. But I'll go through them in a minute. So basically, design thinking is human-centered or user-centered. It is an iterative approach. You are continuously in a loop of discovery, implementation, and kind of iterating within those. It is normative. You are trying to build protocols from this. It goes beyond the design of symbols or objects and interactions. You really want to tap into the human experience. And it's really focused on the process. The process is as important as the outcome. So in that sense, design research is very much about informing our intuition as designers, right? We can be designers of a policy, we can be designers of a public service, we can be designers of an internal protocol, we can be designers of a piece of visual communication. But in that sense, we're always starting with an intuition of what the problem is and how it should be approached. So what we want to do through a design research process is really complement that intuition or maybe that expert approach that we may have on a certain issue. So in that sense, the design process does not exist in a vacuum. It is always contextual to a certain social, cultural, economic, political circumstance. Research challenges, really what we want to do is affront our assumptions and biases. That intuition that we may have regarding a certain problem, we want to make sure that it's something that is backed up by data, by science, by facts, right? Or that we're missing another interpretation of it and really challenge that. And then research helps us really kind of design the right thing and design the thing right. And I really, really like this quote. It's from a former student of mine at Carnegie Mellon, but I think it really nails it. It's really what we are trying to do through a design thinking process. So just to get a sense of the audience, right? Who here is acquainted with design thinking or human-centered design processes? And if you can please take a minute to just write on the chat what you know about the process, if you've ever used it or implemented it, I would love to hear that. So again, please, if you want to add to the chat, you're more than welcome. Never used it before. You have not. Okay, perfect. This is a very kind of overview, broad overview of the process. So it will be a good introduction. We talk about this at Arizona State, where I'm a master's student in the School of the Future of Innovation in Society. Oh, excellent. That's really great to hear, Ryan. Never used it. I have talked about it, never used it. Okay. Yes, with the Department of Veteran Affairs. Awesome. I would love to hear more about that, Kimberly. And maybe we can chat about that towards the end of the session. Haven't used it either. Never used it or talked about it. Interacted a bit. Journey mappings. Yes. And CX initiatives, of course. Don't recall touching on the topic. I've heard about, never used it. Okay. Remember life. Design thinking being used in the context of career development for my career services. Okay. Okay, I learned about human-centered design through my master's program at Boston College School of Social Work. Excellent, never used it, no problem. It's first time hearing about it. Okay, this is great. I took a course of civil engineering and we talked about design. Excellent, great. So yeah, please remember that we have some time to chat towards the end of the session. So if this is completely new to you, feel free to just jot down any questions that you have and we can discuss them towards the end. If this is not new to you, I would love to hear any experiences that you have had with design thinking in your careers, in your work. I'm always fascinated to see how these methods and approaches can be kind of molded and tweaked for different circumstances. All right. Interested in learning more. Awesome. Yes. Perfect. So this is basically the design thinking process. It is a research approach where we want to understand the problem, and we do that through two phases. The first one is empathize. So really work with the communities we are serving to understand what the problems are, what the issue is. We want to also define the problem, and this can complement the empathize phase. Defining the problem may mean doing first-hand research, right? Collecting data. It can also mean doing secondary research, so looking at archives, documents, already existing databases, etc. Doing interviews with experts, right? From there, we want to move into the exploration phase. And this exploration part really entails two big things, which is ideating, generating kind of new creative solutions, alternatives to what is already existing out there. And from there, we want to create easy prototypes that we can iterate upon and that can slowly build with time into a robust final product. And when I mean product, I'm not talking about a physical product, right? Like designing a water bottle, we may be doing that, but we are also referring to products as in services, protocols, processes, policies. So it's a very broad approach to design. And finally, the materialize phase, right? It's making these ideas tangible for the public, tangible for our final users, tangible for the residents that we serve. And so this means testing, understanding if what we did is actually fulfilling a need or not. And finally, implementing. Now, when the Nielsen-Norman group refers to the 6 phases of the design thinking process, this is what they refer to, this is what they're talking about. I will be talking about a 5-phase process, just because the implementation and testing phase, we see it as a kind of back and forth that is intertwined and that cannot be decoupled, because the idea is that once something is implemented, you continually keep on getting feedback, on testing, on improving, and that's why it becomes an iterative process, all right? So this is the research process with its 5 phases: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And basically, what you want to do in each one of the phases is have different processes or methods to inform that part of the process. So in the define part, we will have data collection methods, as I mentioned. In the ideation part, generative methods, perhaps it might be workshops with participants in order to generate ideas of what might be feasible, of what might be desirable. Prototyping methods, I'll show you a couple of examples, especially for digital products. And then testing methods, usually in the testing part, what has become quite popular and we talk a lot about is UX methods, so user experience methods. What is the experience of our final users? What is the experience of our final residents? And there are many methods that we can use for this. We can do interviews, we can do surveys, we can do observations, right? Sort of ethnographic work. So there are many methods that can be used in the different stages of the process. Now, I left empathize towards the end because empathize has become quite a controversial piece of the process. And it's become controversial because even though there is kind of in good faith a sense that we can empathize with the final users, with the residents that we serve, there has been discussion on how actually that can be quite extractivist, because we try to understand the problem of a certain community, but then we are able to remove ourselves from that situation, right? These are not the problems that we as researchers or a public sector professionals, we might be living on a daily basis. And so this empathize part becomes really tricky to navigate. So what I like to think or to do in order to complement this idea of empathizing, of really grasping what the communities we serve might be experiencing, is this idea of participatory methods, right? So really use participation as a way to understand what is happening and create this collaboration between the community and us as public sector professionals or workers. So when I talk about participatory methods, I refer, or what I mean is fair collaboration and fair participation, horizontal participation, where everyone has the same weight in decision-making, in the framing of the problem, in the creation of the solutions, etc. And it's really emphasizing participation, especially from historically underserved communities. And historically underserved communities might be different depending on the context, depending on the place. So this is going to be very contextual as well to your space of work. Now, participatory methods, the way I imagine them, or the way that I would see them graphically, if I had to kind of sketch them out, is that you have a situation or a problem. And from there, you're doing your own research, right? You have a certain intuition or perception of the problem, and you want to complement that with stakeholders' perspectives, with other key actors' perspectives, but especially you want to complement it with the perspective of the people experiencing the situation or the problem firsthand, the people really embedded in the issue. So design methods have usually been used in this second part of the process, right? In prototyping, in testing, as I mentioned, with the creation perhaps of artifacts or digital interfaces that we later on go and test to see if they're usable, if they're easy to navigate, if the experience is good or bad, if there are places where people get confused, right? But here, what we are trying to do is bring into the first part of the process, the discovery phase, the understanding phase, creative methods in which the communities that we serve become really crucial, pivotal, and the center of the research process. Right? So we want to move into this first phase and really unpack that before going deep into thinking about prototypes or solutions or whatnot. So to give you an idea of how this can be implemented in the public sector, I want to give you an example that I worked on in the Mexican government. And that taps basically in 2 steps of the process: empathizing, working with the people impacted by the issue, and defining or scoping the problem. So while I was working for the Mexican National Digital Strategy, I was asked to carry out a testing exercise in collaboration with the Ministry of Labor for a job offering and seeking platform very similar to LinkedIn, basically. Imagine a public LinkedIn. And so we went to the Ministry of Labor's office. This is the image that you see there, where there are a lot of people doing in-person procedures. And some of these procedures take a while, sometimes hours. And we wanted to take advantage of that to do some of our tests, right? And so while people waited, we asked them if they wanted to step into this room and participate in our protocol for testing the platform. And so we gave them a set of instructions. For some people, we would ask them, well, could you use the platform to find a job offering in the service industry and try to apply for it? For other people, we would ask them to post a job offering regarding a certain position. And that way we would have kind of the two experiences, the people posting offerings and then people seeking job offerings. And after we did that exercise, we realized from people's feedback that the platform really needed very minor design tweaks. It was pretty well designed. It was straightforward and easy to navigate. But what was missing was a very important component. And it was jobs and offerings in the agricultural sector. Oops. I don't know what that noise might be. Do you also hear it? No? Oh, unsure of what it is. No, no noise? Okay, maybe it's my computer. I'm sorry about that. So yes, basically we got feedback and it was jobs in the agricultural sector are missing. And this came up because a few young men working in this sector who were doing an in-person procedure actually told us, well, all the jobs here, it's jobs that you'd find in a city, in an urban center, but we work in the fields, right? And I have a phone and I have internet. So why am I being excluded from this? I would love to see offerings that allowed me to work in the harvest of avocados for a season. And then when the season ends, switch easily to the harvest of blackberries, for example. And so this gave us an idea to include an entire section to the website that was focused on agricultural offerings, job offerings. And so one of our main recommendations was just the addition of this section, not really the redesign of any of the portions or sections of the platform. And it really meant bringing to the spotlight the needs of a particular community that was as connected as anyone else in the country, but somehow, because of certain biases, perhaps because the platform was designed from a Mexico City central perspective, it hadn't been taken into consideration when developing the platform and the project. Now, this second example is actually from the design thinking firm IDEO, and it has to do with all of the process of the design thinking process. And so this example is really a demonstration of the use of very simple office materials to prototype a medical device. On the right hand of the screen, you can see the prototype that was created with nurses and doctors during a participatory workshop that was meant to redesign a spine surgery tool. After working with them, doing a lot of interviews, doing these workshops, really trying to understand what the experience in the surgery room was with them, they came up with this idea of a tool that they were able to put together, as you can see, with a marker and just like a clip and a bit of tape. And through kind of iterations of the prototype, they were able to create more and more detail into it, going from a wood prototype to a plastic one to the final example and the final tool on the left hand. Now, this example is quite important because it shows how the human-centered design process is more about understanding the needs of a community, the community that you're working with, instead of designing something that you might think they need, right? And in that sense, very simple, low-cost materials can be a vehicle to facilitate and bring to life those conversations, those collaborations between you and the community that you are serving. Have everyone be really on the same page. Now, prototyping does not necessarily mean creating really high quality physical artifacts. With a growing demand of digital services, prototyping is also vital in the digital world, and a really nice way of starting to create with communities, with your final users, is through paper prototypes. So what you want to do is to be able to change and iterate between your prototype and testing phase very quickly as possible. So you can narrow the gap between what you are imagining as a designer, as a policymaker perhaps, right? And what the community actually needs and what their requirements are. You can see in this image that handmade prototypes, right, of an app, for example, can be very easily discussed and created with relevant engaged actors. And you can do this either through in-person workshops or digital online workshops. Now, in the digital world, we can turn these paper prototypes into digital form by creating wireframes. And in that sense, wireframing is simply an idea of how you want your data to be shown up on the pages of your digital service. It is basically a blueprint or a skeleton of the web page that represents how your product should look like. And so you can see here a couple of wireframes on the left side, low fidelity wireframes, which are very simple. You just want to kind of share these ideas, the layout, the requirements or needs with your final users, with the community that might use this service. And then on the right side, you have a higher fidelity one when you're starting to add copy, right, text, and you're starting to add images and color and some graphic design features. This is another example of wireframes that allow you to share ideas very easily with the communities that you're working with, and therefore have them be participants of your process, right? It doesn't need to be all flushed out or perfect working prototype for you to be able to share your ideas with them. And so that's really the space where these methods come into play, because now once you've gone through the research phase and created a prototype, you can test very easily, tweak the prototype again, test again, tweak again, test again. And that can even happen in the implementation phase. And that's why I like to combine that implementation phase in this final part of the process. Now, there are really hundreds of methods that you can use in the design thinking process, and that can really be plugged into these 5 stages. This is just one book with 125 methods that you can use. So I just want you to take away from this that it's really about starting to scope and define the problem with the communities that you are serving. And from there, use methods in the research, prototyping, or implementation phase appropriately depending on their suitability. There is no one way of doing this. And it's not cookie cutter, and it's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step that you need to follow, but really contextualize it and try to develop the process with your stakeholders. So in that sense, I know that I've given you a couple of examples, but why might a human-centered design or design thinking process be useful in the public sector, especially for your fields, the areas that you're working on, or some of the agencies or offices that you're working with? And I'd love to read you on the chat. Okay, could give us better meaning behind our work. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else? To empathize with users' needs, especially in the nonprofit field, allows us to better serve the population we are trying to help. Absolutely. Creating SOPs, yes. I don't know all of the acronyms, so I would really appreciate, as Hannah mentioned at the beginning, if you can jot down, like really write down the acronyms. That would be really helpful. So NIH, NIDDK, working on publishing funding opportunities using an HCD approach could really inform how to improve the complicated process from the public's perspective. Absolutely, yes, for sure. The needs of a community may be more specific, even simpler than we think when that community is involved in the solution. Absolutely, Jennifer, I love that. I will discuss that in a second. Sometimes it's not about creating new things. Sometimes it's about leveraging and scaling what is existing out there. Absolutely. Our program beneficiaries come from all walks of life. We need to understand how they consume our work. Yes, absolutely. Is a guideline when tackling issues and trying to come up with innovative solutions. Yes, for sure. In education, really need to use HCD in school so that our students are truly learning and achieving. I love that. Yes, really thinking about a student-centered perspective is so important. SOPs, standard operation procedures. Thank you, Veronica. There are a lot of disasters that happen. Federal Emergency Management Agency does their best to serve the impacted communities in the disaster areas. HCD would work in the way that FEMA works together with communities to design solutions and even tools to help these mitigate and recover from these disasters effectively. Absolutely. Yes, definitely. And with an increasing number of natural disasters happening, right? This is going to be so crucial and important. I'm going to just read the 3 that came in, and then I'll move on. But help stakeholders access funding and technical assistance more easily, reducing some paperwork and forms. Absolutely. Just making it easy for people to find resources. For participatory development projects where the end users are involved from the beginning and throughout, not just receiving something. In other words, nothing about us without. I love that, Ryan. Yes, absolutely. Nothing about us without us. I absolutely love that. And then public sector work oftentimes is the only means for certain underserved communities to access services. So making sure that we're solving problems in the right, most equitable form is important. Max, I couldn't agree more. And that is one of the big reasons why I joined the public sector many years ago, because that's really what kind of levels the ground, right? Public services is what levels the ground for many communities around the country and the world. And understanding the experiences of SNAP, yes, a supplemental nutrition assistance program, clients, and what can be improved in providing technical assistance to state agencies that implement the policy. I absolutely love all of your answers and couldn't agree more. It really becomes something crucial when communities really depend on these services, procedures, etc. So making it easy for them to access resources and then navigate them, and then being able to provide feedback, comments, really seeing those loops throughout the process, it can really shift and change the way that basically policy is created, formulated, but also implemented. And the implementation part is so important. It's the kind of the touch point with the communities we serve. Lovely. All right. So just to wrap it up, I want to share a case study about a project that I developed for my PhD research in Mexico City. And it was a development of an app called Mi Taxi, or My Taxi in English. And basically, imagine a sort of Uber or Lyft, but for public taxis. So in 2019, I collaborated with the Digital Public Innovation Agency in Mexico City for the development of the city's taxi app. It was a project that involved doing research about the state of affairs of public taxis in the city, doing service design and UX UI, user experience and user interface, and user interface for the implementation of the app. And we could have approached the project from a very designed, focused perspective, right? What we were required to do was basically just the app. But in the end, we were really developing just a broader digital platform. And so for us, it was very, very important to take seriously and include the perspective and the lived experience of those involved in using public taxis in the city. The process meant fostering new skills and workflows within the agency, so internally for the design team, and also kind of creating a system within the agency where designers could work smoothly and in a kind of feedback loop with developers and policy analysts. So just for a bit of context, in Mexico City, at the time, there were about 140,000 taxis in the city, from which an approximate of 30,000 were considered pirate taxis, so informal, not legalized taxis. They just look like a taxi, but they are not registered in the database of the city. They don't have a medallion or anything like that. And then the Ministry of Transportation did not have a complete database of all the cars and drivers. Now, to make this even more complicated, because each car had multiple drivers, ranging from 1 to 5 drivers, just to keep the taxi going 24/7 and maximize the earnings, it really became a very, very big system, a very complex system for which we did not have a complete idea of what was happening because the database was not complete. So with that in mind, the design team and I set up to design an app that would allow citizens 3 main things. When hailing a cab, be able to check that the car and driver were actually registered in the Ministry of Transportation's database. The second was for citizens to be able to share their ride with someone through a preferred third-party app. We decided not to create a kind of a complicated feature within the app, but rather use what people were already using, which was perhaps WhatsApp's monitoring service, right, to share location. And in the case of a violent incident, be able to activate an emergency button that would connect directly to Mexico City's monitoring center, from where a police patrol would be deployed and guided to the taxi in order to intercept the car as quickly as possible. Now, this became really crucial because at that moment, Mexico City was living really high levels of insecurity and violence, especially against women. And in a lapse of 2 weeks, there had been 3 femicides. So the murder of women for identifying as women, and they had been kidnapped on board of public taxis. So it really became a pressing issue, and mostly for women living in the periphery of the city who used public taxis as one of the legs of their daily transportation trips towards the city center. So we determined there was a need for different levels of engagement to understand the problem, and therefore there were multiple groups we needed to talk to. The first group were other public servants and experts from other ministries and agencies. Then we asked ourselves, who are the most impacted groups by unsafe taxi rides? And we decided we would have 2 groups of people we wanted to talk to. Civil society, kind of as a broad, residents using taxis, and taxi drivers. But because of the context of the time, we did some work with mixed groups, women, men, etc., but mainly focused on women that had to take a taxi as a part of their transportation leg. For taxi drivers, we segmented them into senior and junior drivers. And what I mean by that is that the senior drivers were people that had been driving a car for 20, 30 years, and for whom an app sounded like something they really did not want to use. Junior drivers, on the other hand, were from more recent generations. They drove public taxis for a part of the day, and then perhaps for the other part, drove a car linked to a private company like Uber or Didi. So they felt more comfortable with the idea of adopting an app to work. We did workshops and group conversations with them, and we got very interesting insights. We distilled them and touched base with the Ministry of Transportation. For example, we learned that most women use a third-party app like WhatsApp to share their location with family members and friends when they were riding a taxi. On the other hand, taxi drivers also expressed a lot of fear when working, as they were also subjected to a lot of peril and violence. They also used WhatsApp to communicate to other drivers when something came up. We also learned that there was little trust in having an emergency button because participants considered that if something happened and they pressed it, no response would be elicited from the local government. Now, what I'm showing you right now is a service design blueprint. You might be acquainted with what this is. Basically, what we were doing was mapping the experience of using the app, riding the taxi, and then closing the ride with the app, and looking at it from the user perspective, the person riding the taxi, and then also considering the back end, what would need to happen internally within the agency and other ministries in the local government for the app to function properly. The red flags that you see are places where entire security or technological protocols had to be developed in order for the app to be designed, and where other ministries needed to be taken into account and brought into the conversation to implement these. So our visual map, which is actually a design method, it's called a service design blueprint, really aided our policy colleagues in the agency who were able to start a conversation with neighboring states, for example, on what would happen if the taxi left the boundaries of the city and what sort of cybersecurity protocols would need to be implemented to avoid, for example, extortion via SMS and ensure data privacy. The main protocol that needed to be developed had to do with connecting the emergency button on the app with Mexico City Security and Control Center. And this was really crucial and vital because as we saw during our conversations and interviews with women and taxi drivers, they did not trust whatever we were about to develop. So we needed to make it really reliant and no place for error, basically. So we created a set of very low resolution prototypes, just like the ones that I showed you, the paper ones, exactly the same. They were printed on paper and shared back with the taxi drivers, with people working with us during the workshops, especially women, to see what sort of features and functions were required for the app. Once those functions were determined, we went back to our internal group of public service workers and started to see what were the already existing protocols that could really connect these functions, and which ones would need to be developed from scratch. Some of those protocols entailed coordinating amongst many public offices. Finally, after a lot of back and forth in the creation of these prototypes, we had a functional digital prototype that we could test on the ground. We wanted to make sure that the emergency button would actually trigger the newly designed protocol. So this is a map of Mexico City. We wanted to serve communities that did not have access to private transportation apps and that lived in non-affluent areas of the city, especially in the peripheries, and where low connectivity and high levels of peril for women were quite palpable and present. So we were trying to really set our app to the harshest conditions to test it, to put it to the maximum. The green areas are the zones of the city where private apps operate. And so with these parameters, we selected these areas, the gray dots, to do the tests. We collaborated with taxi drivers who drove us around to test the app and the emergency button. These are the early prototypes that we used to test the app. And as you can see, they still have some glitches and bugs, but they really allow us to go back to the developers team and iterate multiple times. It is also worth mentioning that the app worked like a mirror, and all the features that were provided to residents were also available for taxi drivers, because by working with them, it came to light how many of them faced very similar insecurity issues as people riding taxis. So the app connected to a third party, WhatsApp, and for both riders and drivers, they could just share their location via WhatsApp. This is the final app, and it's actually the first final quote unquote prototype, because this happened in 2019. And since then, they've iterated on the app 4 times. It is still working. And if you go to Mexico, you can download it. You can use it. I believe you can even order. I stopped working on the project, but you can even order a public taxi to a specific location, etc. So they've added many other features. So just to wrap it up, I know that we are almost on time. Why is human-centered design or design thinking important? Why do we think creating a workshop and putting this presentation for you is important? This is really my own personal take, and I'm more than happy to discuss more about it in the following Q&A. But basically, on a daily basis, we're faced with very complex social problems, and these complex problems are interconnected. The reason why we can tell is because we experience them, right? We have this embodied experience of these problems. An ecological problem sprawls into a social or economic one, and that is probably connected to a political one, and so on. And these problems cast a shadow on people's everyday lives, layering on top of each other. We might not be able to fully articulate how it is that they connect, but we can tell. We have this intuition, right? And we can tell because you start to see patterns. Even if we don't have the data at hand, we see patterns. We see that lower income areas of cities have historically not being provided with the best public services, and that when perhaps a hurricane or other natural resources strike, they are the most vulnerable and affected areas of a city, of a place, right? We start to see this over and over again. And so these big complex problems are actually an umbrella of what happens on a daily basis. They are large, complex, and the way that they manifest is in a local way, shaping everyday life. And that's why understanding the daily experience of affected communities becomes so important. This cartoon, I think, sums up well what I'm trying to convey. It is not one thing, but the complex combination of multiple problems that shape the lived experiences of the communities that are most in need. And our current methods have not resulted in more equitable solutions and provision of public services. There are efforts being made for sure, but we are still falling short. A human-centered design or design thinking process can offer a reframing of the understanding of the problem, the generation of alternative solutions, or the leveraging of already existing ones, and especially the ability to prototype and change quickly, because these problems are becoming more and more pressing, and we need to address them sooner rather than later. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your participation on the chat, and I hope this was useful. I'm happy to take any questions or to hear some of your experiences working with design thinking in your careers, in your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Let me just take us off recording as promised.